Luke chapter 9, verse 20 to 23, beautiful passage. If you want to follow after me, you must deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow. Excuse me. We want to talk about two concepts, and to present this concept to students, this is what we want to say, and I'm going to give you one example. There's this principle in Scripture, and it's a real weird passage. It says if you want to save your life, you have to lose your life, but if you go saving your life, you are going to lose life right now, here, today. So the way I say that is if somebody offends me, this is the example. And if when they offend me, I pull out of my little bag of tricks some way to pay them back, some way to get them, or some way to withdraw, to punish them. And who's going to withdraw to punish somebody? What unique self? Feelers. Feelers, right. Feelers will do that. So again, here's one I'm telling you. Obviously, I'm not going to tell the student this exactly right now. But one of the things you might want to look at is when we went to the 4 circles, we discovered what their flesh life looked like, didn't we? When an event happens and they feel what their true identity is, what they feel about themselves, what they're worth, they get angry, and their flesh life ends up looking like this thing over here, which was in our problem circle. So you might want to go back to their history and point out to them what would be their way of saving themselves. Now, I have most often found that this is, although we're going to make it practical, this is another one of those kind of hard ones. So here's a story that I tell from my life experience. I guarantee you, unless some of you, like something happened last night that I didn't know about, all of you have still got flesh. I know it's a real surprise, but we're just going to go with that this morning. All right, now, so here's my deal. Here's the way I saved myself one day. And then I would probably tell them the story I told yesterday, or remind them of the story about going in and wiping my feet on the rug. All right, now, what was I? Do you all remember that story, the little ducky rug? Okay, so I go in, I wipe my feet on the rug. She comes around and she says, I can't believe you're wiping your feet on the rug. This is the most disgusting thing, and so on and so forth. And she starts hammering me. What do you think I was feeling? Just guess. Defensive, angry, bad husband. I should have known better. I'm too stupid to figure it out. Huh? Yeah, how dare she? All those kinds of things like that. But the point is, my next response was, look at the rest of the house. Yeah. How could you be worried about the rug when the whole house is a pigsty? All right, I just saved myself when I said that. Everybody got that? So that's an example of saving oneself. Excuse me. And so what you want to do is go back in the student's history and talk to them about how they saved themselves. Now, here's a couple, 3 examples you might find out. You may find out that student, excuse me, let's say it's an issue with their parents. I guarantee you they've got 3 or 4 really good ways that when their parent does something they like, that they do to sort of get out of having to deal with that issue. Okay? Now, some of them are very aggressive. If it's a doer, they may go for the jugular, with their mom or their dad, and just go on the attack. We interviewed Don last night in his teenage years, and so we're flipping forward to several weeks later. What do you think might have been some of Don's saving self techniques? You guys, how many? Were all of you in here for that or not, or most of you? Okay, we're just guessing. We didn't take all his history. We didn't find out everything, but just from what you heard the other night, what would have been one of his ways that he saved himself in the middle of that conflict with his dad? Stuffed it. Withdraw. Okay. At one point, he lied, which was, a good feeler. To keep himself or to keep the conflict down, they'll lie to you. Anything else? What do you suspect might be some other ways he saves himself? Huh? Yes, sir. There's a big one, glaring one. Go out and do something good. Performing. Yeah, performing. Big time performing. Now, it's really important, and I don't know if Don would have responded this way, but you understand he was one of those church kids. Dad's a big dog guy. Everybody respects him in the community. If you tell him that performing is saving himself, he might be going, whoa, where is that? So you're going to have to take some time to explain to him why that ends up saving himself. And he's going to have, I mean, do you remember he was balking in our session about even going to talk to his dad? So another thing I probably would have put on there, I wouldn't have made him do it the next week. One of the things I would have put on there is him not speaking the truth about something in an appropriate way and communicating. Everybody got that? But if you do not, I know I've said this about almost everything we talked about, somehow you got to massage this thing down to where they're identifying what their saving their self is. And if that means you've got to give 2 or 3 examples of yourself then, of other students you might have worked with, or what you're doing now to save yourself, it's an absolute imperative issue that you flesh that out for them. And you'll see why I say here in a second. So there's that, but what we want to point out is if an offense happens or a hurt happens, if you save yourself, it's going to equal death. Now you say, well, nobody's dead yet at my house. I've thought about it a few times for some people. But now, it's also going to be important that you explain to them what death looks like. All right? Now, if we can pick a Don, we can pick on you this morning, can't you? Leave and send you out the door, beat you half to death, and send you out the door. Okay. How would you explain to Don? First of all, is there anybody that doesn't explain how death happens when you save yourself? And if you don't know what I'm saying exactly, raise your hand. We're not trying to embarrass you. I just want to make sure I'm clear. Okay, so here's the idea. Sherry, by the way, is the one that raised her hand. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. All right, now, in looking at Don, if I say that if I save myself, that it's going to cause, from an offense that happens, it's going to create death. Let's go back to the example of my life. I'm the guy that's working with this student. I'm going to say something like this. You know, that night when I did that, when I came in and did the rug and I said what I said about the house being a pigsty, there were several things that happened in our house that night. One of the things that happened was that my wife was banging all the dishes and the whole night. So the whole night was ruined for her. Here's another thing that happened. My children were very small at that particular point. And it was really interesting to see how they all related. My son, who is a thinker, went and disappeared into his room. And I hadn't seen him all day, and we spent a lot of time together in the evenings. So he just disappeared. He didn't want to be anywhere around it, and he went in there, and he did the things that he always did. He turned on this particular kind of music he liked, and he got his sketch pad out, and he started drawing. And if it was either that or he would just write endless stories. All right? My middle child, which was my daughter Amy, came in, and she's a multifaceted. And I'm telling you, you can drop her in the middle of anything, and she's like a Timex. She can take a hit and keep on ticking. And so she comes in and she tries to keep peace between mom and dad. And then I had my youngest child, who is Erin, she's 4 years younger than the other. And what happened with Erin is she got really quiet. She was in the same room. She wouldn't leave the room. She was really quiet. And finally she turned on the TV, and I noticed it kept getting louder and louder and louder because she didn't want to hear anything. Now, you tell me, is that not death? All because I saved myself. Because, and this is what I want to point out. We're going to point out the opposite now. In a second, we're talking about how that offense could have happened. I could have lost life, and it would have passed out a lot of life, and I'm going to give them an example of that. So let's go back to Don. So that's what death is. It's what happens in a particular moment because I refuse, and I refuse to lose my life, but I go ahead and save myself. Now, from Don's issue, or his history that we looked at there, what do you think might have been death for him? What would have been the death from him saving himself in all the ways we listed? Maybe we'll have to ask Don. You can guess about Don because we didn't get into that. Huh? Okay, there was some sense of uneasiness in him or some things. Huh? Okay, dis-peace. She's making a new word on us. Okay, dis-peace. Okay, that's good. All right, Don, you were there. What would you have observed that would have been some of the death that happened in your family, in you, in them, whatever?
It's hopeless.
Okay. Okay, so hopelessness. Did you hear him saying that when we were interviewing? He had some sense. As a matter of fact, at the end, he's saying, "I'm not sure I want to do that thing, but I'll go on with you." And any other thing you think a student that experienced what he'd experienced, what death might have happened, huh? Okay, there's a standoff, and why is a standoff a problem? Yeah. There's no talk, and we know that we've got a feeler that needs lots of conversation, touch, interaction, that kind of thing like that, and huh? Yeah, there's hurt on top of hurt, on top of hurt, on top of hurt, on top of hurt, and I'd say this, although, huh? He gets to experience rejection over and over and over again because he's thinking he doesn't want to say anything because he's going to feel rejection there too. But we're going to address that in just a second. So all those things. My point is you need to get to, and it doesn't happen just once. You want to point out for them what are some of the things that you're observing, and of course, if you can have them make the observation, it's best of the kinds of things that happen. But at very least, even if we didn't make all this list, we could say this. Did you pick up that he didn't like that he and his dad were at odds with each other? Yeah. It's no fun. As a matter of fact, it does feel like you're dying. That's why you want to leave. Right? All right? So that's all we want to do. Now, all we're doing is fleshing out this passage that says, if you're going to follow after me, you must deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow. So that's one. Now, an offense of losing life will actually bring life to everyone. Now, here's what we want to say. And again, it doesn't take nearly as long as we're taking right now. But here's what we want to say. If I were giving an example of this, I would tell you about another time where my mate and I had an argument, and I didn't want it to escalate, is what I was telling myself. And so I went in the living room, picked up my Bible, and just started supposedly reading. And so she comes in because she's not done fighting, and she says, I'm not finished with this. We're going to discuss this, and on and on and on like that. And I looked up at her and I said, I'm studying the Word of God. All right, now, and I went right back to saying, of course, I wasn't studying. I couldn't have told you where I was if I was in the Old or the New Testament. But I was flipping pretty good. You know what I'm saying? Well, so here's what I want you to see. That statement was saving myself. Except as I sat there, there was a prompting that came into my mind that gave a check in what I was doing at this withdrawal and punishing her. And the Lord's prompting was to go apologize. I don't want to do that. That's what I'm calling you to. I don't want to do that. And I can remember saying to the Lord at that moment, Lord, I know what the right thing to do is, and I know that that's your leading at this particular point, but I don't want to do that. So here's the deal. Lord, I can't even have the want to do this. So I'm telling you, I give up. Well, what you're asking is too much, so it is going to have to be your doing if it's done at all. Now, I'm not saying the Lord hooked to me and dragged me into the kitchen, but I heard that, and I heard His prompting, and the door flew open, and Christ's life began to move. It's very important that you keep hammering that point home with your students. The door came open, and I go in to apologize to my mate. In the middle of me trying to obey God, I heard another little thought in my head that went like this. You know, if you apologize, she's going to say, I told you so. And the Lord's prompting was to go ahead. And I tapped her on the shoulder lightly, and she turned around and said, I just want to tell you, I was very out of order, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry for the tone in which I took with you. It was really interesting. She didn't say, I told you so, but she did the I thing, which indicated, I told you so. You know what I'm saying? But when that happened, something broke in me, and I was free. I was completely satisfied, even though she still thought I was an idiot. She still gave me the cold shoulder the rest of the night. I was just free. And it wasn't my work, it was Christ's work in me. Do you think a student could get a hold of that example? Well, of course they could. And that's me, not trying to be a student. That's just me being me. And my flesh looks the same as everybody else's. It just has gray hairs every once in a while and all that. But the point being, they can get a hold of that. And so then I want to go back to their life. And the bottom line is maybe talk through with them. This is a step. I can't write this all on here. But begin to talk through with them what losing their life might look like. And then I'm going to invite them. And you know, the truth is, if I had a 16-year-old in front of me, even if they get this concept, they might be struggling with saying, oh, okay, I get it. I'm supposed to do no. Again, I would encourage you, and even at that moment, say, listen, why don't we just ask the Lord? And over this next week, you're going to continue to petition the Lord what losing your life in that situation would be. Now, we're going to spend the most time on this diagram, so don't think we're disproportionate on our time. But if you had to guess, and again, we're not trying to give Don solutions, but if you had to guess what might be Don losing his life with his dad, what are some suggestions? What might losing his life with his dad look like? Huh?
Speaking up to him, like telling him.
Okay. With respect, tell him the truth, and even ask for whatever he might have done. Now, we're not guaranteed Dad's end result, and I'm going to address that in just a second. So that's a way. What's another thing he might do, not to save his life, but to lose it? Anybody? Huh? He can still play football or not play football, but you might discuss with him some ways that he moves out of performance-based acceptance. Now, you got to understand. Well, I didn't hear that. Well, well, thanks, brother. Yeah, Don's feeling a lot better. You are sending him out in a good way, aren't you? But I want to have some discussions about what performance-based acceptance might be. Now, I want to caution you. The level of anxiety that Don had connected with his dad, we aren't going to have one discussion about this and it just be all peachy and over. Which really is, I'm glad that we had that particular dynamic to look at, because here's a part of your job with students when you're interacting with them. The whole shooting yourself thing is sort of on the end. But my point being that with students, Don knew from the get-go, from the first session, that I might be asking him, maybe even before he came in the room, he's a pretty perceptive kid, he might have thought that I would say something about us having a big powwow with his dad. But he wasn't ready to go there. And my guess would be that's probably a pretty fair response to what you would have said had you been in that situation. It is not my job to make him die to himself. I can encourage him. I can give many examples of how God's moved in me, because I'm going to make a huge point here in just a second. Why would any student ever try this? Now, this is what I'm going to say next is going to be a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of students, because there is a promise or a reality, however you'd like to say it, and it's this: that if I will lose my life, I'll be satisfied. I can still have hurt, and the circumstances may not change, but what satisfies a believer is obedience, obeying. You've got to make this point with him. Jesus said when he was offered food, he says, "Don't you know that my food, my satisfaction, is to do the will of the Father?" The book of John. Now, I'm telling you, if you find one, you can call me up and I'll send you a $10 bill, unless they've been to an Abiding Life seminar. I dare you to find a student that had somebody look at him and say, if you don't save yourself in a particular situation, Christ's Spirit inside you, even though you will still have hurts and your emotions may do some of this, there's something inside you that'll start being satisfied. And because the life of Christ loves obedience. And when Jesus was here with the body of a man and the soul of a man and faced with a situation to either save his own neck or lose his life, he chose to lose his life. Story in the garden is a perfect story to tell with this. And he chose to lose his life, and he was completely satisfied in that, even though, even on the cross, we hear him crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And all we want to point out to the student is obedience. You've become somebody different, and you can't do sin anymore. And it may be fun on the front end, but you will not be satisfied with this. You're going to have to really trudge through with them about this. So, because in Don's mind, it'd be real easy for Don to say, hey, listen, what you're telling me that performing and doing well is like wrong? That doesn't compute for me. And that's why number one, you're going to have to be very cautious as you move through this, that they get the point of what we've been talking about. And more importantly, Don would have to see that is it. Now, he said it, and he knows it, that he was performing. He said it himself. I play football, but I don't even like football. And I'm doing it just for my dad. So it's not, he wouldn't be as hard as, he may not emotionally love it, but as far as understanding it, Don's not going to have as hard a time understanding it as some others. Because he himself, in his gut, he knew he was doing that. Now, but remember, emotions follow behind reality, right? I'm going to rephrase. Don said, for the sake of the camera, he may not have gotten it at 16 years old, but at 20 or 25 or 35 or 40, it would kept him from continuing in the performance track. And the reason we want to point that out, some of you didn't come into some of the understanding about this to your adult years. And by the way, you got it. And everything was smooth sailing from there, right? And you bought it immediately, and all of a sudden, all that stuff you were struggling with was just a piece of cake, right? Oh, no. No, so that's a very excellent point. Carefully, her comment is we don't want them to get the idea, if a student maybe wasn't where Don was at, that they just get to shut down and don't do anything ever, that there's nothing, that there's no activity, that it's everybody else's responsibility to do all the work. All right? Now, again, and I know I'm being repetitive, this is what I want to get clear to you. Let's assume that Don and I continued, and he's 16 and I'm with him. The reason, first of all, we're going to find out whether or not we believe obedience actually satisfies the believer. That's the first thing. Because you've got to present that concept. It's got to be, this is where I'm drawing my line in the sand, and because what I'm basically eventually going to do is try to challenge him to, among other things, have a conversation with his dad. That's not the only issue. And he may not choose that. But I'm going to find out whether or not I believe whatever. And maybe forget the whole talking to the dad. Maybe it's 2 or 3 other kinds of things. Excuse me. But you're going to find out whether or not you believe that obeying Christ actually satisfies the believer. Now, let's say we got a little different scenario with students, and we're just taking the time here to discuss with this. Let's say that we're working with a student who is pretty mouthy. And rather than highly compliant, I've got a mouthy student. So what's their deny self, take up the cross, lose their life?
Be quiet.
Sometimes to be quiet. Not all the time, but sometimes to be quiet. And we're going to track with them and help them understand that that's an idol. And we'll do our 4 circles with them. And we're going to come back to that again and again and again. Excuse me. These things are not any less true if they don't experience them, or whether or not they do experience them, they're still the truth. And if God took years to hammer this home in you, I want to have this 16-year-old kid have the opportunity to see what the truth is. And by the way, it's God's business how quickly he gets it, right? Okay, the question was, could hopelessness be an idol?
Sure.
And that's what gets you through your day.
So can depression.
So can depression. The point being, if my whole identity is I'm the guy that doesn't have hope, you could easily move there. And that's how I've learned how to, that's my tools. I operate in a hopeless environment. Follow what I'm saying? Yeah, sure. All right, a couple more things quickly here. Excuse me. I'm also going to have a conversation with them at this time. This is all the saving life and losing life. I'm also, and you can just put it anywhere on here, the other part of the passage says I'm going to deny self. This is taking up the cross. And in simple terms, because I can come back to it later with them, but I'm going to deny self in 2 or 3 ways. And for students, this is some of the communication I give them about this. Obviously, denying self can be what has been my way up to this point. Now, do I have any foundation of information to point out to them what has been their way? Yes, I do. Because I've been tracking with them. We've described what we would call their flesh condition is. But for the students, so first of all, I'm going to establish what has been their way. Now, I'm not going to beat them to death and say, oh, you horrible person. And we're just saying, look, this is the way you've survived. I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you showed back up again. But a second thing for students, and I'm not saying this is the all-inclusive discussion about denying oneself, but this a student can get a hold of. I'm going to declare what's the truth and what's the lie in this situation. And let me give you an example. First of all, I'd encourage them that, listen, if you got to do that, you have to verbalize that with your mouth, or you have to write it down, or whatever you do it. But in this situation with my dad, I'm going to ask God to begin to reveal to me what's the truth and lie, and what the stuff that I know to be a lie, I'm going to say it. So, for instance, one of the lies I would have worked on over a period of time with Don would be to point out to him that he's believed a lie, that if you do perfect, you'll have acceptance. Well, you know what? I could have told him some examples in my life of where I did do it all. I was better than anybody else I knew, and I still felt horrible on the outside, on the inside. So that's what I'm talking about when this whole, what's the truth and what's the lie? Do you remember Mike talked about to you that whole neural pathway thing, and you got something twice for a whole year and the whole deal? With a student, one of the things that I may do as a regular part of when I get together, say getting together with them once a week, is to say, listen, have you discovered some more things as you've been talking to the Lord, some things that are a lie? And if maybe the Lord's revealed some things to you that's a lie, just put it right out there on the table and say, listen, I wonder if this is true. Because sometimes you say this and it really, really sounds like to me that you believe this. Do you think maybe you believe that? You see where I'm going with this? And then invite them with you right now to say, Lord Jesus, I know, it looks like to me, here's yet one more lie I've been buying. And then, Lord, at least alert me when I'm starting to react out of that stuff. That's a beginning place. Can you see that? So another part of denying self is saying what is to deny something. If you walk up and say to me, I'm a girl, I'm going to say, no, I'm not. If you walk up to me and say, I'm a member of the National Cricket League, or whatever that is, I'd say, no, I'm not. And all we're trying to get them to do is to engage. Denying self is not just the action of it, but making it, to deny something. Usually if I deny something, I end up either by inference or by actual doing it, I declare what is the truth. And so that's another thing in terms of denying oneself. A third thing we talk to them about in denying oneself, and you can add to this, these are just the things that I found that have been real concrete for them, is I own what is my weakness, although I don't use those terms. I acknowledge, or I say, you know, this thing's a weak thing in me. And that with Christ's help and His direction, I set out on a course that acknowledges that I have that weakness. And this is what I mean. If I've got a kid back in the States right now, and he's really struggling with this whole issue of pornography on the internet. And I said, well, listen, has the Lord delivered you from all that yet? And he said, no. I said, well, okay, recognizing that you've got this weakness and you didn't come in this week and tell me that the Lord's delivered you from all that, recognizing your weakness, what is it that most exposes you to that? What are the acts that when they start happening, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to go there? Because that's your self-pattern. Your self-pattern has a little switch in what's happened. You can choose today to ask Christ to alert you when the trigger's coming up. And as soon as you do that, in His strength, say, Lord, I choose to move away from that. all the while understanding that Christ's life is moving. Lord, I can't do anything with you, but I know that if I get over there right now, I am so weak, whether it's I'm weak in my faith, I'm weak in my character, whatever they're weak in. The point is, in the middle, if there's 5 steps to doing pornography on the internet, by the time I hit number 1, I'm gone. It's like a slippery slide. And so I'm asking them to deny self-expression with Christ's power in them before they move to the place where they don't have the maturity to go to anymore. You see what I'm saying? Now, a student can get a hold of all that. All right, any comments or questions about this? All right, the next thing we're going to talk about, and we'll just go as far as we can before we break for our session, is this. So show me the way I can stay in my right mind, and I realize I'm going to repeat yet again. But I'm telling you, you've got to get this. When you start bringing up concepts, number 1, that are foreign to people, and number 2, is something that's not the normal flow of everyday language, it would be real easy for us to say, well, save your life, you got to lose, and lose life, you got to save life, and deny yourself, take up the cross. You might as well just be, you've seen the new Mellow Yellow or commercial, or Dr. Pepper commercial, where the girl's sitting at the table, and the guy starts talking, she drinks her soda, and he's just going, whatever the funky, yeah, that kind of thing.
Charlie Brown.
You can't let this come out like that. You have got to take the time, and I don't care if you take 3, 4, 5, 6 sessions. I don't care if you take the next 2 months to keep coming back to this issue, because you're going to find out later on today that this is one of the things we do with people in follow-up. Is where are you at? Where are you at, and where God's been leading you in dealing with the things that you need to deny and take up the cross in. There's really 2 parts to this diagram then. One is the denying oneself. The other one's being willing to take the hit. And of course, there's several passages that we'll deal with in this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10 to 12. Every day we're carrying around the death of Jesus in our body. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 10 to 12. Death is at work in us, but life's at work in you. Analogies that have the idea of, a brother shared with me recently, and this is connected with what Don was saying, that the wages of sin is death. That's fine, but out of death comes life when Christ is in the middle of it. And so any of those kinds of scriptural analogies and processes, I'm assuming you've got a lot of those passages already down that we've covered with those, but we want to share them with the student. All right. Brother, we got 5 more minutes? Is that all right? Okay. All right. Show me the way I can stay in my right mind. We're just going to stay in my right mind, subtract. So the first one is I need to learn. An offense plus losing life equals life to everybody. Now we're going to learn how to subtract. There are many voices in my head. There's my voice, my thoughts, God's thoughts, and Satan's thoughts. And we're going to point them to Psalms 139 here. Just point out to him that there's 3 kind of thoughts that are talked about there. Another passage, the evidence in Scripture in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We recognize that we can be tempted, but God will provide a way out. So the temptation is in my mind, but God also is providing a way out of the temptation. Excuse me. In 2 Corinthians, and we'll look at this a little bit later, chapter 10, 3 to 5. Well, we understand that when we start dealing with thoughts from Satan, we wage war in a whole other way. So however you'd like to explain that in terms of the scriptural context, but the first step to this is explain to them that there's God's voice and Satan's voice. Now, please note that a lot of times we cover the idea of Satan speaking to us in the third person singular, or in the normal flow of things. We use that in the earlier diagrams when we talk about the creation of self and that understanding. For the students, I make the major emphasis back here on the tail end, and here's why. I'm trying to describe to them how they can keep on the right track afterwards. So even if you explained it earlier and brought it up earlier, I want to bring it up here in 2 very specific ways. So the first thing I'll do is say, listen, I just want to teach you, God has the ability to drop thoughts into your head. Satan has the ability, although his power is limited, to drop thoughts into your head. And what I'm going to do, is tell you what those things would be. Here's some of the things that I usually tell them, and for sake of time, I'm just going to switch diagrams on you here just for a second, okay? And you can write those down as you go through, but I just go through with them and I give them an example. God's voice is the voice of the shepherd. He's gentle and he's not harsh. So this is what I tell them. Anytime, I'm going to tell you how to fight against the enemy in your head later on, and how Christ will have you deal with those thoughts. But understand this: if you start getting thoughts and they are restful to you, and rather than harsh and driving, then you move with what's gentle and restful. And and they say, "What do you mean harsh?" I mean, have you ever had thoughts where you just feel like you got to do it, you got to do it, you got to do it? But that's not going to be from the Lord. Another thing is the Lord's going to lead you. Satan's going to drive you again with the harsh thing. Jesus is called the light of the world. When you start getting thoughts about something, and there's clarity to it, then that's from the Lord. When you start having confusion, then there's a problem there. An example I would give them of that is I was having a conversation with somebody once. Everything was fine. Thanks, brother. Appreciate that. Everything was perfectly fine. And we were in full disagreement with each other. For 45 minutes, we were disagreeing with each other. Everything was fine. I had a thought came to me about what needed to happen. And the minute I brought up that thought, the conversation went from a healthy disagreement where we were encouraging each other and challenging each other's thinking to a downward spiral. And we were in complete confusion. And the person I was with looked at me and said, "Tim, why did you just make that suggestion?" And I said to them, "Well, I'm pretty sure the Lord spoke that to me. That's the reason I said it." Well, that doesn't make sense to me, because I thought you teach that if you have a thought and as you begin to play it through, it just adds a bunch of confusion, that it can't be from the Lord. And I said, "Oops." So I just said, let's just forget what we've just said. We're going back to where it was clear. You got that? And so a student can understand that. Again, Jesus is called the light of the world. Satan, anything that you feel like causes darkness. You'll hear a description from people sometimes. They just feel like they got a cloud around them or something like that. There's darkness and confusion. God is going to give you peace or confidence in a situation. Satan will always move in you out of fear. When he says to you, as a matter of fact, if he's fearful, you're probably about to win, because that's a bully technique. Brother, where are we at?
You're good.
Okay, we're good. All right, and as God will always lift you up and encourage you. Satan is going to beat you down. Your burdens are going to increase. If you confess your sin to God, there's a conviction. You'll tell God that you're sorry. You want to move out on this, and you get in with Him. On the other hand, Satan will come back again and again with the same thing. He'll remind you of the same sin. And I just turned to a student and I asked them, "Have you ever confessed to God the same sin over and over again?" And of course, you know what we tell them. If you have, the first time you confessed it, if you really did settle that with the Lord, He's never going to bring it up again. But if you've been confessing it after that, Satan has been disguising himself as God, and you've been confessing that sin to Satan.
Is that when you're still doing it?
We're not talking about doing it. We're talking about whether they're doing it or not.
Okay.
There's a legitimate, "God, I'm sorry." And anytime you confess something to God and you come with godly sorrow, He releases you and the burden is lifted. But on the other hand, Satan will come back and try to get you to do emotional gymnastics to try to get you to say, "I'm sorry," over and over and over again. And it can't be the Lord in that situation. Here's the one. God will always draw you to the moment. Satan draws you to the negative past or the negative future. God will confirm what He's already said in His Word. Satan will distort the Word. But I usually use this as an example, and I have an example for all of these that with students. But I tell them about the gal that I won to Christ. She came in. We discipled her for 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, she came around, and she put all her books on the desk and said, "Tim, I just wanted to come say goodbye to you." I asked her, "Are you leaving? You going out of town?" Nope, nothing like that. And she burst into tears, and she said, "I won't be back. I'm sorry I've wasted your time." And she went on to tell her story that just 2 days before that, she'd been having her devotion time. And she's reading out the book of Hebrews. I mean, not Hebrews, but Revelation. And in chapter 3, it said this, and she read it to me. "You're neither hot nor cold, you're lukewarm, and I'm going to spew you out of my mouth." And she said, "God told me that was me." Well, I'm a little dumbfounded. I said, let me see that. I don't remember. So I read it, and right after it, it defines what a lukewarm person is. You have said, I have no need for God. And I just asked her, I said, do you need God? For 25 minutes, as fast as a machine gun, she went on about the glories of God and how much she needed Him. As a matter of fact, she'd just soon die as to live without Christ. And I just looked at her and I said, look, sister, I'm sorry, but guess who showed up for your devotion on Wednesday morning? It was Satan. It was Satan. And so those are the kinds of things. This is what I want to encourage you. You may not have a story for every one of these. Mike certainly tells some story to illustrate some of these in the book, but you go through every single one of these and ask God to reveal to you how you could explain that to a student. And it needs to be that real. But catch this now, and then I'm done for this session. It is absolutely imperative that you get communicated to a student the concrete realness of the fact that God will invade your thought patterns and that Satan will drop thoughts into their head. And there is a spiritual realm. There's spiritual stuff going on. And because a student has a tendency to take things like, and I know this is my big deal right now, the charmed ones, your charmed ones, but that's a TV thing. And although Satan uses it as a woo, he also uses it as, oh, that's something that kind of happens on TV and so on. Now, if you've got a student that believes in the whole spiritual thing, in the whole spiritual realm, fine. But what I'm trying to get you to do is to realize in the churches I grew up in, yes, we acknowledged there was Satan. And yes, we said he had power, but he's still kind of sort of out there, kind of a non-entity. No impact, sort of, kind of, except maybe the devil maybe do it kind of thing. What I'm asking you to do with this diagram with students is draw them into the reality that every single day of their life that they are involved in this war thing, and here's how it's going to come down. It's kind of like what happens when we have the divorce care program at our church. One of our goals is to talk to them about the realities of how this thing works and what you have to jump through and all the emotions that goes with that and stuff. Well, that's what we're telling them here, is there's a reality of this whole spiritual war that goes on inside their mind. And, well, of course, we're going to point out to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 to 5, that's an imperative that we don't wage war like we normally wage war. We have different battles, we have different things we use, but we're going to judge every thought and every emotion and bring it obedient to Christ and so on. So you've got to communicate to them the reality of this spiritual war that's going on. How do you do that? When I get together with Drew, that's a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old, one of the conversations I have with him is I start communicating to Drew about how I had to deal with those thoughts and emotions in my mind in situations where I was having to ask Christ to help me judge that whole situation and so on. We're going to pick that back up with this a little bit later. We're done. Be back at about 15 till.